In this video, I just want to ask you guys a question because it's likely you're all aware of the murder of Renee Nicole Good over in Minnesota. I like the way that sounds in America, Minnesota. Don't know if I'm saying that right, but yeah, in Minnesota by a nice agent called Jonathan Ross. And strangely enough, after the shock of it, it kind of flipped me back to the Conservative Party conference back in October, because in that conference, Kemi Badenoch floated the idea that Britain should create an immigration enforcement body modelled, at least in spirit, on America's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, a dedicated agency here in Britain with expanded powers, visible enforcement and a very clear message about control. Now, before anyone reaches for their keyboard to accuse me of dodging reality, let's start with something important. A lot of people in this country have concerns about illegal immigration, not imagined concerns, real ones. They have this perception that it causes a pressure on housing, a pressure on public services, and they have a sense that the system is unfair when the rules are followed by them and ignored by others. And that frustration exists, and pretending it doesn't is part of the reason why trust in politics is so low and the trust in Nigel Farage is so high. But acknowledging that problem does not mean we stop questioning the solutions being offered to us, and that is where this idea of an ICE-style department needs to be examined very carefully. Because when politicians talk about ICE-style, they're not just talking about efficiency, they're talking about a model of enforcement that is aggressive, highly visible and intentionally intimidating. In the United States, ICE is not simply an administrative body processing paperwork. It's an agency that conducts raids, it separates families, it operates detention centres that have been repeatedly criticised by courts, journalists and human rights organisations. It's become a symbol not just of border control, but of fear. And we in Europe know implicitly why these symbols matter. Supporters of this idea argue that Britain needs to get tough, that existing enforcement is too fragmented, it's too weak or too slow. They say a single powerful agency would restore order and act as a deterrent. They say if people believe the law will actually be enforced, fewer people will actually break it. And that sounds simple, but that's just how populist politics is always supposed to sound. But the first question we have to ask is this: what problem are we actually trying to solve? Is it illegal entry, or is it visa overstays? Is it exploitation by employers? Is it the criminal gangs? Or is it the political perception that government looks out of control? Because an ICE-style agency does very little about the root causes of illegal immigration. It doesn't stop employers underpaying undocumented workers. It doesn't speed up asylum decisions. And it doesn't fix the backlog that leaves people in limbo for years. What it does do is shift the focus from administration to enforcement, from policy failure to visible punishment. And that shift comes with consequences. And to understand those consequences, let's go back to America. ICE has not only targeted criminals, despite what is often claimed, it has also targeted people with no criminal record beyond their immigration status, people who have lived in communities for years, people who had children in school, people who paid their taxes. The result was not a cleaner system, but a climate of fear where even legal migrants avoided hospitals, they avoided schools, they avoided the police. Now imagine that here. So imagine in Britain, okay, where people are afraid to report crimes because they fear an immigration officer might turn up instead of help, where victims of exploitation stay silent because the state looks more like an enforcer than a protector, where entire communities feel under suspicion, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are assumed to be. And that's not hypothetical, because that's exactly what's happening in the US right now, and I'm really feeling for them. And then, of course, there's the question of power. An ICE-style department would require expanded authority, more surveillance, more data sharing, more detention capacity. Once those powers exist, they very rarely stay neatly contained. We've seen this in Britain before, from things like stop and search to the hostile environment. Policies introduced as targeted tools ended up being applied broadly and often disproportionately. As an example, we were told that the hostile environment would only affect illegal migrants, but instead, it wrongfully targeted British citizens.
Targets for removals, when were they set?
We don't have targets for removals.
But there are deportation targets, and her department knew of them. They affected the so-called Windrush families, who settled legally in post-war Britain, but whose right to remain was questioned.
Windrush was not an accident. It was a definite warning about what happens when enforcement outpaces accountability. So when ministers like Kemi Badenoch talk about copying ICE, we have to ask, what safeguards would exist? Who would oversee this agency? How would abuse be prevented? And crucially, what happens when the headlines demand tougher action and restraint becomes politically inconvenient? And another uncomfortable truth is that ICE, for all its budget and power, hasn't really solved America's immigration problems. Illegal immigration has continued under multiple administrations. The Americans have had problems with this for quite a while, and the system remains overwhelmed. Although I'm hearing that Trump has done quite well in getting those numbers down, which may be his only success. But the difference is that the human cost has increased while political leaders get to perform toughness on television. And that performance element really matters because an ICE-style department doesn't just enforce the law, it sends a clear message about who belongs and who is a suspect. It hardens attitudes, it encourages an us versus them framing that may initially win votes but corrodes social cohesion. And we're seeing this right now in the States. But none of this means doing nothing. It doesn't mean open borders, it doesn't mean ignoring illegal immigration or pretending that our borders don't matter. States have the right and the responsibility to enforce these laws. But enforcement can be boring, it can be administrative, it can focus on employers who exploit cheap labour rather than the workers who are trapped by it. It can prioritise fast, fair asylum decisions so people aren't left in limbo and the numbers build up. It can invest in legal pathways that reduce illegal ones. None of that makes for dramatic press conferences or populist propaganda, but an ICE-style department does. And that's the danger. That we choose spectacle over solutions, that we import the aesthetics of control without learning from the failures that's attached to them. So, as you think about this proposal from Kemi, and I keep calling her Kemi, I don't know why, from Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives, I want you to hold on to two thoughts at the same time. One, yes, illegal immigration is a real issue for many people in this country and it deserves serious, honest policy responses. And two, copying one of the most controversial enforcement agencies in the Western world may not be serious, but theatre. We don't just have to ask whether we can build an ICE-style department. We have to ask whether we should, given what we already know, what we can already see over there in the States. And that brings me to the question that I want to leave with you guys, and that's, after seeing the issues with ICE in America, would you have an ICE-style department here in Britain? Is Kemi... I've done it again, I've called her Kemi. I saw a skit on some YouTube thing a while back and it made me laugh and I just got stuck with Kemi. But is Kemi Badenoch onto something with this? Let me know in the comments and I'll see you there. Ciao. Ciao, ciao.